In this video, I'll share a few different things I've done recently to improve my paintings. I'll show you a barn owl I painted 2 years ago, and I'll compare it with a barn owl that I painted this week. One advantage of teaching is that it motivates me to learn more and to keep improving my skills. In addition to painting as much as I can, one way I continue to learn is to read, and another way is by studying the works of artists I love. Those two things have made a big difference in the way I paint now. I painted a barn owl 2 years ago before I joined Patreon, and I posted a video of the painting here on YouTube. Quite a few of my patrons have asked me to make a full-length version of that tutorial and post it on Patreon for them. I said I would, and I started voicing over a full-length version of it, but my heart wasn't in it because now I don't paint like I used to paint 2 years ago. I've grown, I've learnt more, and I don't want to sit there and voice over a painting that I know I could paint better. So I painted a new barn owl, and I'm currently editing a full-length tutorial of this painting. In this video, I want to show you a few of the differences between the painting I did this week and the painting I did 2 years ago, and I hope that you'll see that I've improved in that time. I decided to use a different reference photo for the new painting. Even though both owls have a similar pose, I wanted to start fresh with a new photo to stop myself from doing the same things that I did with the original painting. The reference photo that I chose for my new painting was taken by Bruno van der Kraan, and I downloaded it from Unsplash website. The paper I used was different. This earlier painting is painted on Arches hot pressed watercolour board, which is no longer made. And the second painting I did is painted on Arches cold pressed 640 GSM paper. This is my favourite paper to paint on at the moment. It's thick and it has a beautiful texture. I find cold pressed paper is more forgiving. I find it less slippery to paint on than hot pressed paper, and I think it's easier, especially for beginners, to get good results on cold pressed paper. I used less colours on the painting I did this week. I used a limited palette of only 4 Winsor & Newton colours: burnt sienna, French ultramarine, gold ochre, and Van Dyke brown. So that's 3 differences. Now I'll show you how I painted it differently. With the first owl, I had hard edges all the way around the outside edge. And when you paint like that, it tends to make the subject you're painting look flat. With the new painting, I drew on the outer edge of the owl with broken spaces to remind myself to leave lost edges there. And that helps to give the owl more form and make it look less flat on the paper. I felt a soft edge would indicate the softness of the owl more than a hard edge, which would show a more stiff or sturdy surface. To create the lost edges, I painted in a soft background using the same colours that I was going to use on the owl. In this case here I'm using gold ochre. I wet the background with water first, and when I wet it, I wet the background as well as the owl. So when I put the paint on, I started to paint in the owl at the same time as the background. Here I'm painting on some grey that I mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm painting in the background, but you can see I'm also taking it onto the owl. That's the colour that I need on the owl there. So that's the colour I chose for the background. I'm keeping the paint within the edges of the water to make sure I've got soft paint edges where I want them. And I kept the water off the area of the owl that I didn't want any colour on. Then I added a bit more work to the front of the owl and I let it dry. So here you can see how the background flows onto the owl, or the owl flows into the background. I painted in the eyes and the beak, And then I started to paint in the top of the head. I'll come back to the eyes later in this video. Here you can see I've got my pencil line on the outer edge, so I know I can put a hard edge there. So I've got the paint and I'm painting right up to the edge of my pencil line. And that will give me a hard edge. It will start to define the top edge of the owl's head. This is gold ochre and I'm painting on wet paper here. Then I started to drop in some black that I mixed for the eyes. So that's given me a hard edge where my pencil line was, which is what I wanted. At the top of the head, in the middle, I've got no pencil line. So that's to remind me not to let the paint go right to the edge there. I want to try and let it drift off into the background and not paint an edge at all. So I wet that area with water and then I started to paint in some black markings to suggest some feathers up there. This is on wet paper to keep the paint edges soft. Then I worked the markings over to the right hand side where my pencil line is again. You can see how I haven't put any up near the top edge. So this edge along here, I haven't put any paint. And then over on this side, again, I've got a pencil line where I can make a hard edge. So I take the paint all the way over to the pencil line. And that's given me a hard edge on that side. Here on the side of the head, you can see I've left my pencil line off the edge. So this edge along here is missing. I haven't drawn it in. So I know again I need a lost edge there. So I want to keep the paint away from that outer edge so that the owl will merge into the background. All I'll do is paint a few little spots here and there. This is the black that I mixed. Down further on the owl, I've got a pencil line again, so I know I want a hard edge here. This is gold ochre again that I'm painting on the wet paper. And then I start to drop in the black paint again to create those markings that are on the feathers. So now you can see that lost edge that I've got there where I haven't put any paint. The edge of the bird there is the same value as the background, and that creates the lost edge where it merges into the background. Your eye doesn't need to see an edge. It can visualize the edge of the bird by lining up the two hard edges that I've painted in. As I said, doing that in various places around the edge of the owl helps to give it more form and stop it from looking so flat against the paper. The way it does here on this first owl painting that I did. I've got the hard edges all the way around the outside. So that's one way that I'm starting to improve my paintings. Here's another. On the first owl painting, I sat there for hours painting in the little feathers that surround the head. I painted many of them in individually by layering the paint and painting in the shadows. It was time-consuming and laborious, and I find the end result is difficult to look at now. In contrast with this second painting, I wasn't going to sit there and paint all those feathers in for hours. So instead, I wet the paper and I worked wet on wet, and I suggested the feathers rather than state them so obviously like I did on that first painting. Here I've got the grey paint that I used on the background, but I've mixed a bit more pigment into it, and I'm painting on the wet paper. All I'm doing is dabbing my brush on the surface to release the paint, and that brings in the front edge of those feathers. That was a bit of water there. I'll do the same thing here. Dab the paint along the pencil line and it bleeds with the water that's on the paper. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to fuss any more than that. Here on the side there's another group of those little tiny feathers that surround the face. I've wet the paper and now I'm dropping on the grey paint. Now I know I've sped this up, but it was very quick. It didn't take long at all to paint them in. Here's something else that I did differently. This is the earlier painting. Here I'm using a tiny liner brush to paint in the fine feathers that surround the eye. I'm layering the paint and I'm working on dry paper. I'm trying to be really careful with the way I place my brush strokes. Now when I paint, I rarely, if ever, pick up my tiny liner brushes. I don't think I've used a fine brush like this for at least a year. What I did on this new owl instead, I wet the entire eye, over the top of the eye, with water. And then I got some burnt sienna and I painted the area around the eye on the wet paper. I've got a bigger brush. I'm letting the paint bleed. So instead of having a whole lot of hard edges there, I've got soft edges. Instead of being a slave to the reference photo, I use it as a guide and I suggest things rather than follow it exactly as I see it. I did the same thing around the other eye as well. Then after I painted the eyes in, I started to use some Van Dyke brown over the top of the area that I painted wet on wet before. So you can still see the bleeding of the paint underneath these hard lines that I'm painting now. And I'm not using a tiny little liner brush. This is a number 3 round brush. It does have a fine tip though. So I've got a combination of soft lines and hard lines here. On the first painting, I spent quite a bit of time on the feathers on the wing. It probably took me an hour or 2 to paint all of these feathers in. I masked some of them off with some masking fluid and I worked wet on wet for the brown markings. And then when they were done, I came back over the top with my liner brush again and I started to paint around the marks that I made with the masking fluid. So there's quite a bit of detail work in that and it took me a while to paint it all. With my latest owl, I used a large brush and I was determined not to spend too long on the wing. I tried to use bold, confident brush strokes and not fiddle with it too much. Here I've got my smaller brush and some black that I mixed. And I'm painting on the black markings. The brush had a bit too much water in it, so I tapped the side of it on the paper towel to get rid of some of the moisture. So I dab this black on while the gold ochre is still wet, and then it bleeds over the top. There's some wing feathers here on the side that I thought I'd like to include. The definite feathers that you can see on the reference photo, and I thought that that would be a nice bit of detail to add. But again, I didn't want to fuss too much. I wanted to get them in there as quickly as I could. So I used my big brush again. This is a number 8 Da Vinci Maestro brush. It holds a lot of paint and a lot of water, but it's got a really fine tip on it, so I can hold it right up on the point when I want a fine line. Here I'm starting to add the black again on the wet paper. So as much as possible, I forced myself to use my larger brush. I think the wing area here took me about 10-15 minutes or so to paint. I'm not saying here that speed is important. What I'm trying to get across is that it doesn't have to always be so labour intensive. I know now that a good result can be achieved when I paint confidently with big brushes and when I accept what the paint and the water gives me. In the past, I've tried to control it too much. Now when I paint, I want to let the paint show me things. I still need to control it to a degree because that's in my nature, but I can learn to give it a bit of breathing space and let it do what it wants to do. Towards the end of the painting, I went back to the head and started to darken a few areas. I wanted a bit more contrast up near the eyes and the face because that's where my focal point was. Here I'm putting a bit more gold ochre up the top just to increase the colour there. And there it is finished. It was quite a simple painting that didn't take me very long, and I really enjoyed painting this one. Another difference, I worked on the first painting for a few days. The second painting took me about 2 hours, and those 2 hours were relaxing and fun because I didn't become overwhelmed with all the detail. I relaxed and I let the watercolour do a lot of the work for me. I used a big brush as much as I could, which forced me to not focus on the detail. And I'm much happier with this second painting. I hope that I will continue to improve my painting skills, and maybe if I decide to paint another barn owl in a year or two, I'll see further improvement. So don't give up. Keep practicing, keep reading, keep studying the work of other artists you love, keep watching these videos. And I'm sure you'll see your own work start to improve as well. As I said, I'm making a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. I'll be posting it either in late August or September. I've got a few tutorials to post on there before this one. Thanks for watching. As always, a like on this video is appreciated, and please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. The reference photo that I chose for my new painting was taken by Bruno van der Kraan. No, Bruno van der Kraan. 640 GSM paper. This is my favourite paper to paint on at the moment. It's thick and it has a beautiful texture. And I'm losing my voice. The paper I used was different. This earlier painting is painted on ash dust. I used a big brush as much as I could, and that forced me to focus on the detail. No, it didn't. The big brush forced me to not focus on the detail. That's what I meant to say. I relaxed and I let the watercolour do a lot of the work for me. I used a big brush as much as I could. Yeah, big brush. I've got big brushes. Thanks for watching. As always, a link on this video is appreciated. A link, yeah. Please link this video for me. Thank you. It's appreciated.